This morning I woke up coughing blood into my rag and counted 3 new boils on my left arm. A few years ago, that would have sent me screaming to the nearest medical facility. Now it's just another Wednesday in the delightful paradise that is our Nurgle-blessed city. I wipe the crimson-flecked phlegm from my lips, check that my respirator filter still had some life left in it, and shuffle toward what passes for my morning routine. The walls of my hab unit glistened with a fresh coat of condensation and mold. Black, green, and a particularly virulent shade of orange that seems to spread an inch every week. Just the normal sights, sounds, and smells of waking up in grandfather's garden. My name is Marcus Valen, though that identity feels increasingly distant with each passing day. 7 years ago, I was a mid-level technician in the water reclamation district, maintaining purification systems and monitoring contamination levels in Hive Primus. I had a small apartment, a modest shrine to the Emperor, and dreams of maybe one day earning enough to move to a cleaner level. Simple aspirations for a simple man. Now I wake each day in what used to be that same apartment, except the walls weep toxic moisture, and the shrine has been converted into a nest for Nurglings. You get used to it, I suppose. I hardly flinch anymore when I hear the wet, rattling cough of a neighbor through the paper-thin walls, or the sound of something heavy and diseased dragging itself down the corridor outside. Someone's either shambling to their work shift or shambling toward transformation into something far less human. On this world, the line between the two gets thinner every day. I just keep moving, one foot in front of the other, trying not to think too hard about the fact that my left foot has gone partially numb and the skin around my ankle has taken on a grayish-green hue. A few other hollow-eyed folks shuffle along the communal stairwell with me, each of us careful not to touch the railing that's coated in a substance that might be rust, might be dried bile, or might be something actively growing. We don't make eye contact. Eye contact means acknowledging what we've all become, and that's a luxury none of us can afford if we want to stay sane. The transformation of our world didn't happen overnight. It was a slow rot that took months to consume everything we knew. Looking back, the signs were obvious. Quarantine zones expanding weekly, officials dismissing rising death tolls as seasonal flu, the gradual replacement of medica staff with plague cultists, who spoke of diseases as blessings. By the time we realized what was happening, the infection had spread too deep to excise without killing the patient. I grew up when this planet was still under the Imperium, back before the plague fleets arrived and the Death Guard made planetfall. Emperor-fearing, sterile, and brutally efficient, that was the world of my childhood. We toiled for the God-Emperor day in and day out, sure, but at least the air didn't taste like rotting fruit and corpse gas. Every morning, I'd wake to the sound of the local voxcaster blaring hymns to his glory. My parents would make me recite the standard prayers before our meager breakfast. Emperor, deliver us from disease. Deliver us from corruption. Deliver us from the unclean. I mouthed the words dutifully back then, never imagining I'd one day be choking on those very words while surrounded by literal walking corpses and plague-ridden zealots who worship rot itself. This morning's ritual begins with what the plague preachers call the counting of gifts. I examine my body for new infections, new growths, new signs that Grandfather Nurgle is blessing me with his attention. 3 new boils on my left arm, up from yesterday. The rash on my back has spread another 2 inches. My right eye weeps a yellow discharge that I've learned to wipe away before it crusts over. These aren't gifts I asked for, but refusing them isn't an option. Those who resist too obviously, who seek treatment or try to cleanse themselves, are marked as ungrateful. And the ungrateful have a habit of disappearing into the plague pits, or being volunteered for the plague priest's experiments. The morning light filtering through my cracked window has that familiar sickly green tint, a product of the toxic clouds that permanently shroud our hive city now. What used to be a clear view of the industrial sector is now an impressionist painting of rot, vague shapes of buildings, and smokestacks bleeding into a haze of pollution and airborne pathogens. Sometimes I see shapes moving in that fog, massive and slow, and I'm never quite sure if they're industrial machinery, plague drones, or something worse. The nobility survived the transition better than most, if you can call what they've become survival. They used to hide their corruption behind gilded masks and sterile palace walls. Now they parade it like a badge of honor. The noble families, those that survived the initial plague waves, immediately prostrated themselves before Nurgle's champions. Many had already been worshipping Grandfather in secret for years, their private physicians quietly treating exotic diseases they deliberately infected themselves with as acts of devotion. These days, the lords and ladies of the spire live in a perpetual state of competitive decay. They've renamed themselves with titles that would be laughable if they weren't so horrifying. The Duke of Suppuration, the Countess of Festering Wounds, the Baron of Beautiful Rot. I'm not making these up. I saw them announced at a mandatory public gathering once. The nobility now considers physical decay to be the highest form of aristocratic bearing. The more diseases you can host simultaneously while remaining conscious and mobile, the higher your social status. They hold grand balls where guests compare their newest infections like others might compare jewelry. I once had to repair a water line that connected to the noble quarter, which gave me a horrifying glimpse into their current lifestyle. Through corroded grates, I caught sight of their high society. Banquet halls where the tables groaned under platters of food that was already rotting, deliberately cultivated with exotic molds and bacteria. Nobles lounging on furniture that seemed to be partially alive, upholstered in material that pulsed with organic growth. Servants scurrying about with trays of delicacies. I saw one platter that appeared to hold something that had been food, then become host for a garden of fungal growths, and was now being served as cuisine. The nobility doesn't bother with subtlety anymore. They'll descend from their spires in grand processions whenever they feel like it, carried in palanquins by plague zombified servants, surrounded by clouds of disease-bearing flies that form almost decorative patterns in the air. When they parade through the mid-hive streets, we're expected to line up and cheer their magnificence. If a noble's eye falls on you, Emperor help you. Best case, you're invited to serve in their household, which usually means a slow death from exposure to their weaponized disease collections. Worst case, you're selected for ascension, which means they'll use you as a test subject for whatever new plague concoction their pet plague surgeon has bubbled up. Then there are the cult priests and plague preachers, the new unholy men and women. In the Imperium, we had the ecclesiarchy preaching the emperor's word. Now we have the cult of the fly, the putrid communion, and a dozen other plague-worshipping congregations spreading Nurgle's gospel of entropy and acceptance. They roam the city in rotten processions, their robes stained with every bodily fluid imaginable, ringing bells covered in rust and corrosion, chanting hymns to decay in voices ravaged by disease. Every few days, there's some kind of mandatory religious observation or blessing ceremony that we're all expected to attend. I often see the high rot speaker of our district, a man who used to be a respected Imperial preacher before he found Nurgle, standing atop a pile of diseased corpses in the main square, delivering frenzied sermons about embracing the gifts of decay. He's usually accompanied by a swarm of Nurglings, those disgusting little demons that look like tiny, bloated, giggling imps made of solidified disease. They crawl over him during his speeches, nesting in the holes that have opened in his torso, and he treats them like beloved grandchildren. Missing these ceremonies is not an option, If you're absent or even look insufficiently enthusiastic, the plague enforcers might drag you onto the stage as a volunteer for the next blessing. I've seen what those blessings entail: forced inoculation with experimental diseases, ritual scarification with infected blades, or being thrown into pits filled with Nurgle's garden, a churning mass of diseased flesh and toxic sludge, where people either die quickly or emerge transformed into something that barely remembers being human. Surviving in a place like this requires adaptation that would have horrified my younger self. The first step was blending in, learning to play the part of a grateful recipient of Nurgle's blessings while internally screaming at what I was becoming. I saw what happened to those who resisted too openly, the Emperor loyalists who tried to fight or maintain their purity, public torture if they were lucky, transformation into plague spawn if they weren't. I had no desire to join them, so I did what I had to. I stopped trying to clean my wounds, let the infections fester just enough to look appropriately blessed without becoming life-threatening. I forced myself to attend the plague gatherings, to mouth the words of praise to Grandfather Nurgle, to wear the small icon of the 3 circles that marks me as one of the faithful. In the beginning, I was terrified my facade would crack, that they'd see the disgust in my eyes, but people see what they want to see. If you shamble and cough and display your diseases with the right mixture of pride and resignation, you become part of the background. And being part of the background is survival. The next step was understanding the new rules and hierarchies. Work assignments are still mandatory, but they've changed in nature. Instead of maintaining systems to prevent contamination, I now maintain systems that spread it in controlled ways. The water I once purified now carries carefully measured doses of disease, enough to keep the population sick, but not so much that we all die off. It's a delicate balance, and those of us with technical skills are valuable because we can maintain it. Food is a constant challenge. The official rations are contaminated by design, part of the ongoing program to reshape us into proper children of Nurgle. But there are ways to make it less lethal. Boiling helps, though fuel is scarce. Certain molds and fungi that grow in the damp corners of buildings are actually edible and provide some nutrition, assuming you can keep them down. I've learned which puddles in the lower levels contain water that's merely disgusting rather than immediately fatal. It's amazing what the human body can adapt to when the alternative is starvation. Mentally, the adjustment has been harder. At first, I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about what had been lost. But you can't live on adrenaline and horror forever. Eventually, exhaustion wins. I've found strange ways to cope. One is focusing on small routines, something as simple as organizing my meager possessions or checking my equipment before work shifts. In a world gone mad, these tiny acts of order provide anchors to sanity. Another coping mechanism is dark humor. When everything is so utterly insane and horrifying, sometimes the only way to process it is to laugh quietly at the absurdity. I make snarky observations in my head about the crazy things I witness, like I'm a spectator in a twisted comedy. When our work supervisor announced a day productivity bonus for the worker who displayed the most aesthetic disease progression, I had to bite my tongue not to laugh at the absurd corporate cheerfulness of it. Dry sarcasm, even if only in my own mind, keeps me anchored to who I used to be. You might think trust would be impossible here, but humans are social creatures even in hell. Over the years, I've identified a few kindred spirits, fellow survivors who haven't completely drunk the diseased Kool-Aid. We don't have open conversations about how we really feel. That would be suicide. But there are subtle ways we watch out for each other. There's an older man at my work site, Grigory. He knew my father in the old days. Grigory plays the role of an obedient, half-delirious laborer, but I've caught glimpses of clarity in his eyes. Once, during a particularly brutal punishment detail, where we were forced to haul infected corpses to the rendering pits, I felt myself starting to break down. Grigori deliberately stumbled and created a distraction, giving me a moment to compose myself. We never spoke of it, but I nodded to him and he gave a barely perceptible nod back. That's how we communicate. Tiny gestures of humanity in an inhuman world. No discussion of life under Nurgle would be complete without describing the mandatory celebrations. The Festival of Rot, also called the Grand Bloom, happens twice a year to commemorate major victories of the plague forces. Attendance is mandatory, and the penalties for absence are severe. I've learned to dread these events more than almost anything else, because they're when the facade of normalcy completely breaks down and we're forced to confront exactly what our world has become. The festival I remember most vividly occurred about 3 years into the occupation. Notices were plastered everywhere, weeks in advance. Carnival of Decay. All citizens rejoice in Grandfather's Garden. The whole hive city was transformed for the occasion. Banners made from diseased skin hung from buildings. The streets were cleared of the usual debris and corpses, only to be decorated with carefully arranged displays of rot, artistic installations of decay that the plague priests spent days perfecting. Bioluminescent fungi were cultivated to provide lighting, casting everything in a ghastly green glow. The main event took place in Unity Plaza, ironically named under the Imperium, and still ironically appropriate. My work crew was herded there by mid-morning, all of us given festival masks to wear, grotesque things made from molded fungus that supposedly bore the likeness of Nurgle himself. The idea was to make the crowd look uniformly celebratory, whether we felt it or not. Thousands packed the plaza, shoulder to shoulder in the oppressive heat and humidity that our world has become. Nobles occupied the elevated viewing platforms, while we, regular folk, were crammed below. The festival began with a high rot speaker giving a sermon. He stood on a platform constructed from the fused corpses of plague victims, arms spread wide as if to embrace us all. His voice was amplified through vox casters that seemed to make the very air vibrate. He spoke of how blessed we were to live in Grandfather's Garden, how our suffering was actually joy if we'd only open our hearts to it, how decay was the natural state of the universe, and we were privileged to witness it so intimately. The crowd roared approval on cue, with enforcers prowling the edges to ensure proper enthusiasm. Then came the demonstrations. Plague Marines made an appearance, 7 of them in full, corrupted armor that wept fluids and crawled with smaller organisms. They were treated like celebrities by the faithful. These were the legendary Death Guard, traitor Astartes, who had been fighting for Nurgle since before the Horus heresy, and their presence was meant to be an honor. They demonstrated their weaponry, blight launchers that spewed clouds of virulent toxins, plague knives that caused instant necrosis, and the sickening resilience of their enhanced bodies. One voluntarily allowed himself to be shot multiple times by a heavy bolter to show how even grievous wounds couldn't stop Nurgle's chosen. After that came the sacrificial offerings. Not deaths, which would be wasteful, but transformations. The plague priests brought forth volunteers, and I use that term loosely. Some were genuine fanatics, eager for the ultimate blessing. Others were clearly prisoners who'd been selected. They were led to great vats of bubbling, diseased slime, Nurgle's garden made manifest. One by one, they were pushed in or jumped willingly. The screaming was terrible, but so was the laughter. Some emerged, transformed into plague bearers, humanoid but barely, their flesh running like wax, new eyes and mouths opening in random places. Others didn't emerge at all, presumed dissolved or absorbed into the greater mass. The grand finale involved the summoning of demons. A great circle was inscribed in the plaza using infected blood, and the chanting began. I felt reality itself growing thin, the air taking on that particular tension that precedes a warp breach. Then they came through, a pack of plague drones, massive fly-like demons ridden by smaller plague bearers, and at the center, a great unclean one. The demon was enormous, a mountain of diseased flesh that radiated wrongness like heat. It spoke, if you can call that gurgling, jovial voice speech, praising the faithful and promising greater blessings to come. People near me were weeping with joy or terror. I couldn't tell which. I just tried to keep my mask in place and not vomit, which would have been seen as either a blessing or an insult, depending on context. The aftermath of that festival was more than just physical exhaustion and psychological trauma. Something had changed in me, or perhaps I'd finally acknowledged what had been slowly changing all along. The next morning, I woke to find that the rash on my back had developed a pattern, 3 circles in a triangular arrangement, Nurgle's mark appearing spontaneously on my flesh. I panicked, scrubbing at it with contaminated water and a rough cloth until my skin was raw and bleeding, but the pattern remained, slightly raised and tender to the touch. This was the moment I'd been dreading since the occupation began, the moment when Nurgle's corruption stopped being something external, something I was play-acting at accepting, and became undeniably part of me. I spent that entire day in a haze of denial and terror. Was I becoming one of them? Had I resisted so long only to succumb anyway? The worst part was that, along with the fear, there was something else. A strange comfort, like slipping into warm, fetid water after fighting against the cold for too long. A whisper in the back of my mind suggesting that maybe resistance was futile. Maybe it would be easier to just accept, to let go and embrace the decay. I found myself at Elina's underground clinic that evening. Elina used to be a Medici apprentice. Now she runs a sort of secret hospital in our hab-blocks lower levels, disguised as a drug den to keep the authorities disinterested. I showed her the mark, and she went very quiet. Elina has seen countless cases of corruption, but seeing it on someone she knows, someone who's been fighting it, that hit different. She examined me carefully, checking for other signs of advancing mutation. The verdict was grim, but not hopeless. The mark was real, but it hadn't spread to my internals yet. I wasn't transforming, just marked. She gave me something I hadn't expected, advice on how to slow the progression. There are certain fungi that grow in the deepest, darkest parts of the underhive, parasitic species that actually feed on Nurgle's more aggressive infections. They don't cure anything, but they can slow the spread, keep you human longer. It's dangerous to harvest them. The deep underhive is where the full plague spawn lurk, things that were human once but have gone so far into corruption that they're barely recognizable. But Elina knew people who made regular expeditions, scavengers and desperates who'd risk anything for something to trade. Over the following weeks, I began a new routine. Every few days, I'd choke down a paste made from those fungi, mixed with whatever cleanish water I could find. It tasted like death and smelled worse, but it worked. The mark on my back stopped spreading. The new infections that appeared were manageable rather than progressive. I bought myself time, though at what cost I wasn't sure. The fungi themselves were changing me in subtle ways, my sense of smell becoming more acute even as other senses dulled, my tolerance for toxins increasing, my skin taking on a slightly grayish tone that could pass for malnutrition if you didn't look too close. The question that haunted me during this period was whether I was actually fighting corruption or just choosing a different form of it. By using Nurgle-touched fungi to combat Nurgle-touched diseases, wasn't I still playing into grandfather's garden? The philosophical implications were maddening, and I couldn't discuss them with anyone without revealing too much about my true state. So I kept it all inside, another weight added to the psychological burden I was already carrying. Romantic relationships in this environment are complicated beyond measure. Slaaneish's domain has lust, but Nurgle's domain has a different kind of intimacy. The intimacy of shared suffering and decay. People pair off, but it's less about attraction and more about finding someone who can understand what you're going through, someone to hold when the night terrors come, someone to help clean wounds you can't reach yourself. I've avoided such connections, partly from fear of losing them, partly from not wanting to inflict my corruption on another person. There was someone once, back in the early days. Her name was Kira, a fellow technician who survived the initial plague waves. We'd worked together before the fall, and in those chaotic first months, we clung to each other for comfort and sanity. But Kira embraced the new order faster than I did. She saw acceptance as survival, and threw herself into the cult's teachings. The last time I saw her, she was leading a prayer circle in the factory, her body covered in ritual scars and blessed infections, her eyes bright with genuine fervor. When she saw me, she smiled with what seemed like pity and invited me to join the truly faithful. I made an excuse and left. Better to remember her as she was than confront what she'd become, or what I was refusing to become. If you want to understand true horror, venture into the deep underhive of a Nurgle-held world. The upper levels, where most civilians exist, maintain a grotesque semblance of order. But the deep underhive is where civilization has completely broken down, where the rot has advanced so far that reality itself seems negotiable. I've only been down there twice, both times out of desperate necessity, and both times I barely made it back with my sanity intact. The first expedition was to retrieve those anti-corruption fungi Elena needed, a group of 5 of us, all people who had reasons to risk death for a chance at slowing our transformations. We descended through maintenance shafts that hadn't been properly maintained in years, past levels that had been sealed off and marked as contaminated even before the occupation. The air grew thicker with each level, not just humid but substantial, like breathing warm soup. Our lumen packs provided the only light, and that light revealed things I wish I could forget. The walls down there aren't walls anymore. Their surfaces covered in a thick biomatter that pulses with slow life, a living carpet of mold, fungi, and things that might have once been human tissue, but had been absorbed into the greater mass. Sometimes you'd see shapes in that living wall, faces or hands pressing out as if trying to escape, though whether they were trapped souls or just random patterns was impossible to say. The floor squelched underfoot, and you had to watch every step because some patches were solid enough to walk on while others would give way into pools of reeking slime. We encountered the deep dwellers, humans who'd fled down here to escape the initial plague waves and had survived by fully embracing corruption. They weren't zombified Poxwalkers, but conscious, aware beings who'd been changed so dramatically that calling them human was generous. Some had developed additional limbs. Others had skin that wept constant fluids. Still others had fused partially with the environment itself, becoming hybrid creatures of flesh and fungus. Most ignored us, too lost in their own degraded existence to care about visitors. But some watched with hungry eyes, and we kept our weapons ready. The fungi we sought grew in a chamber that had once been a water reservoir, but now held a toxic lake of unknown depth. The fungi formed luminescent colonies on the walls, pulsing with sickly blue light. Harvesting them was dangerous. They released spores when disturbed that could cause vivid hallucinations or worse. We worked quickly, filling containers while trying not to breathe too deeply despite our respirators. That's when we heard it, something massive moving through the ceiling tunnels toward us. The deep dwellers scattered immediately, which was sign enough that we should do the same. We never saw what was following us, but we heard it, a wet, dragging sound accompanied by labored breathing that echoed through the tunnels. Something huge and suffering and hungry. We ran through passages barely wide enough for our bodies, splashing through toxic pools, scraping against walls that tried to hold us with organic tendrils. 2 of our group didn't make it back. I heard their screams behind us as whatever that thing was caught them, and then the screams became something else. Laughter mixed with agony, the sound of transformation beginning. The second time I went to the deep underhive was worse because it was a punishment detail. Our work crew had failed to meet production quotas. Some equipment had broken down, and we couldn't repair it in time. As punishment, we were sent to the rendering pits to process corpses. The rendering pits are where the dead are taken, where bodies are broken down into component materials that get recycled into everything from fertilizer to food supplements. It's necessary work in a closed system, but it's also the worst assignment you can get. The pits are enormous vats filled with bacterial sludge that dissolves organic matter. Bodies are dumped in by the hundreds, and we had to use long poles to push them under the surface and break up any clumps that formed. The smell was beyond description, a physical presence that made your eyes water and your throat close up, even through multiple layers of filtration. The heat was incredible, the bacterial action generating temperatures that turned the pit room into a hellish sauna. And the sounds, the gurgling, bubbling, occasionally something that almost sounded like voices as pockets of gas escaped from dissolving corpses. We worked 12-hour shifts in rotating teams because any longer and you'd collapse from heat exhaustion or toxic exposure. During my shift, I saw things float to the surface that couldn't be identified, chunks of matter that might have been human once but had been transformed into something else before death. Once I swear I saw a fully intact face float past, its eyes open and seemingly aware, before it was pulled back under by the churning sludge. Another time, something grabbed my pole from below and tried to pull it, and me, into the pit. I let go and backed away, and my supervisor just laughed and said grandfather was testing my resolve, 7 years into the occupation, and I'm still here, still breathing, still mostly human, still holding on to the fragments of who I used to be, with a grip that gets weaker every day. The question that haunts me now isn't whether I'll survive, it's whether survival at this cost means anything. I've become an expert in existing without truly living, in maintaining the minimum requirements for life, while everything that makes life worth living slowly rots away. The Imperium isn't coming to save us. I accepted that truth years ago, though I see newcomers to our situation go through the stages of denial and hope before reaching the same conclusion. We're written off, contaminated beyond redemption, a loss already calculated and mourned. If Imperial forces ever do return, it'll be with exterminatus, to purge the infection by destroying the entire world. We're not citizens anymore. We're disease vectors, and the Imperium's response to disease is always the same: burn it out. In recent months, there's been talk among the resistance. And yes, there is a resistance, small and fragmented and probably doomed, but it exists. Talk of somehow sending a message off-world, of finding survivors with technical skills to cobble together a Vox transmitter powerful enough to reach Imperial space. I've been approached about helping, given my technical background. The idea is simultaneously foolish and desperate, exactly the kind of plan that emerges when you've got nothing left to lose. I haven't decided if I'll join them. Part of me wants to believe we could make a difference. Another part knows that even if we succeeded, the response would likely be orbital bombardment, rather than rescue. Daily life continues its grotesque rhythm. I wake, I count my new infections. I go to work maintaining systems that spread disease rather than prevent it. I attend mandatory worship sessions. I choke down contaminated food and that bitter fungus paste. I help Elena in her clinic when she needs an extra pair of hands. I exchange subtle nods with Grigori and the handful of others who remember what it meant to be human. It's a thin existence, stretched between horror and habit, but it's existence nonetheless, The changes in my body continue, despite all efforts to slow them. My left arm has developed a tremor that never quite goes away. My lungs wheeze with every breath, infected with something that feels like it's growing rather than healing. My reflection, when I dare look at it, shows someone I barely recognize, gaunt, scar-covered, marked with disease, eyes that have seen too much. But I'm still conscious, still capable of thought, still able to feel disgust and despair and the occasional flicker of dark humor. By the standards of this world, that's a victory. Sometimes I wonder what future historians, if such things still exist, will make of us. Will we be a footnote in some imperial record, lost world, corrupted beyond redemption, population estimated in millions, all deceased? Will the Death Guard keep our world as a recruitment ground, harvesting the strongest survivors to transform into new plague marines? Or will we simply rot here forever, a monument to entropy, until the heat death of the universe finally claims what Nurgle's plague couldn't? I've stopped praying to the Emperor, not out of loss of faith exactly, but out of pragmatism. If he exists, if he's watching, then he's already decided our fate, and my prayers won't change it. Instead, I've developed my own small rituals. Every morning, after counting my infections, I recite the names of people I knew before the fall, my parents, my old work crew, friends from better days. It's my way of keeping them alive, of maintaining some connection to the world that was. When I can no longer remember their names, that's when I'll know I've finally lost. The resistance movement reached out again yesterday. They're planning something, desperate and probably suicidal, but they've asked for my help with the technical aspects. I told them I'd think about it, which is as close to yes as anyone gets in this environment. Maybe it'll fail, and we'll all die screaming. Maybe it'll succeed and bring down orbital fire that kills everyone. Or maybe, just maybe, it'll accomplish nothing except giving us a moment of defiance before the rot claims us all. But here's the thing I've realized after 7 years in this nightmare. It's not the grand gestures of resistance that keep you human. It's the small ones, the moments when you help someone without being ordered to, the times you share your rations with someone weaker, the quiet acknowledgement that you see another person's suffering and it matters to you. Every time I help Alina in her clinic, every time Grigori creates a distraction to protect someone, every time we silently recognize each other's humanity, we're resisting, not in a way that'll change anything, but in a way that proves we haven't completely succumbed. I've watched people go through stages in this environment. First is shock and denial. Then comes bargaining, trying to find ways to minimize the horror. Then anger and despair. Some people get stuck there and either transform or find ways to end it. Others reach a kind of acceptance, not of Nurgle, but of their situation. They find ways to continue existing without surrendering who they are. I'm somewhere in that stage now, existing in the narrow space between human and something else, maintaining that precarious balance through sheer stubborn will. The irony doesn't escape me that in resisting Nurgle's corruption, I've had to use his own tools. The fungi that slow my transformation are themselves products of his garden. The diseases that mark me give me just enough credibility to avoid suspicion. I've become a walking contradiction, fighting rot with rot, using decay to prevent worse decay. Maybe that's grandfather's joke, that even resistance is part of his cycle. Or maybe it's proof that life finds ways to persist, even in the most hostile environments. There are others like me scattered throughout the city. I'm sure of it. People maintaining their humanity through force of will and careful pretense. We'll probably never coordinate into anything meaningful. We'll never overthrow our oppressors or reclaim our world. But we exist, small pockets of defiance in an ocean of corruption, and somehow that has to count for something, even if the only one counting is me. So I'll continue my routine. Wake up, count my infections, go to work, attend the mandatory gatherings, help where I can, take my fungus medicine, exchange subtle nods with the few who understand, and try to sleep despite the nightmares. It's not heroic. It's barely survival. But it's mine. This small rebellion of continuing to exist as something approximating human in a place designed to strip away humanity. And if I'm being honest, spite has become one of my primary motivations. The spite of refusing to give in, of maintaining consciousness and identity for one more day just to prove it can be done. If you're reading this somehow, if some record of our existence survives, understand that we tried. Not all of us became monsters willingly. Some of us fought in our own quiet ways to remain ourselves. We didn't succeed in any grand sense. We didn't save our world or even ourselves. But we maintained fragments of humanity in hell, and maybe that's worth remembering. Or maybe it's just the delusion of a dying man trying to find meaning in meaningless suffering. Either way, I'll keep going until I can't anymore. Because in the end, stubborn endurance is all I have left, and I'll be damned, more damned than I already am, if I surrender it without a fight.